grew up playing them. Family game nights, laughter, friendly competition. But what if I told you, some of your favorite childhood games were never meant to be fun? Behind every cheerful spinner, every brightly colored board, lies a story of war, greed, disease, or injustice. Tonight, we're peeling back the glossy box lids to reveal what the manufacturers never wanted you to know. The dark history of the games that define generations. Because somewhere between a roll of the dice and a turn of a card, we lost the truth. We start with the biggest name of them all, Monopoly, the symbol of capitalism, greed, and victory through domination. Born in 1866 in Illinois, Elizabeth Magie, known as Lizzie, was a woman who refused to be ordinary. In an era when women were expected to marry young and serve their husbands, she remained fiercely independent until the age of 44. She worked as a stenographer and secretary. She wrote poetry and short stories. She performed comedy on stage. At 26, she even patented an invention to improve typewriters, at a time when less than 1% of patents were filed by women. But Lizzie's true passion was political activism. Her father had been a close friend of Abraham Lincoln and a committed abolitionist. Together, they followed the teachings of economist Henry George, who believed that while people should own what they create, the land itself should belong to everyone. This was the height of the Gilded Age. Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. These men owned everything, and the working class owned nothing. In 1903, Lizzie filed a patent for the landlord's game, a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing with all its usual outcomes and consequences. Here's what makes it brilliant. The game had two sets of rules. One, the prosperity rules, where all players benefited from each other's success. Everyone prospered together. The other, the monopolist rules, where players crushed their opponents into bankruptcy. The point was to show that the monopolist version was morally wrong, that the system was broken, that cooperation, not domination, should be the goal. The game spread through progressive circles, left-wing intellectuals, Quaker communities, college students. At the Wharton School of Finance, socialist professor Scott Nearing taught it to his economics students until he was fired in 1915 for criticizing industrial capitalism. Students made their own versions. The game traveled by word of mouth, changing slightly with each retelling like a folk song. In Atlantic City, Quaker families added their own local street names to the board: Baltic Avenue, Boardwalk, Marvin Gardens. They removed the dice and bidding to tone down the chaos of the game. And that version, that Atlantic City version, eventually made its way to a dinner party in 1933. Charles Darrow was a heater salesman who'd lost his job in the Depression. At that dinner party, he was taught the game by friends. He loved it so much his host typed up the rules and mailed them to him. Darrow drew his own version on a circular piece of oilcloth. Then he did something Lizzie never could have imagined. He claimed he invented it himself. In 1935, Parker Brothers bought the game from Darrow and made him a millionaire. Darrow became known as the inventor of Monopoly, a rags-to-riches story for the Depression era. But Parker Brothers knew the truth. They'd rejected Lizzie's game years earlier as too complicated. Now, to secure total control of Monopoly, they tracked Lizzie down and offered her a deal. $500, no royalties, no credit. And in exchange, they'd publish two of her other games as a consolation prize. In January 1936, Lizzie gave an interview to the Washington Post, trying to set the record straight. She showed them her original boards. She explained that Darrow hadn't invented the game, but by then, it was too late. Parker Brothers pushed her story aside. Monopoly was flying off shelves, and Lizzie's protest game had become exactly what she warned against: a capitalist empire. She died in 1948 at age 81, buried in Arlington, Virginia, largely forgotten. It wasn't until the 1970s that her story resurfaced. An economics professor named Ralph Anspach created a game called Anti-Monopoly. Parker Brothers sued him. And while researching his defense, Anspach uncovered Lizzie's patents, her interviews, her entire buried history. The greatest irony? Her game about the evils of monopolies became the world's most successful monopoly, and the woman who created it got nothing. Next up, the game of life. Today it's about filling tiny plastic cars with even tinier plastic people, spinning a wheel, buying a house, and racing toward retirement. But in 1860, the game looked very different. Milton Bradley was born in 1836 in Maine. He moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, and worked as a mechanical draftsman. But his real passion was lithography, the art of printing images on stone. In 1860, Bradley thought he'd hit the jackpot. He printed thousands of portraits of a clean-shaven Abraham Lincoln, who'd just won the Republican nomination for president. Then Lincoln grew his famous beard, and overnight Bradley's entire stock became worthless. Desperate, he turned his attention to something new: games. He created the checkered game of life, a 64-square board modeled after a checkerboard. But this wasn't a game about money. It was a game about virtue. Players began at infancy and tried to reach happy old age, worth 50 points. Along the way, they could land on honesty, bravery, perseverance, and advance toward success. Or they could stumble into idleness, in crime, in ruin, poverty, or even suicide, and watch their score plummet. This was the height of Victorian morality. Bradley was deeply religious. He believed games should teach children how to live a righteous life, that every choice had consequences, and instead of dice, one which were associated with gambling, the game used a teetotum, a six-sided spinning top. The game was an instant success. Bradley sold 45,000 copies in its first year, 1860. Then the Civil War broke out. Bradley stopped production briefly, then pivoted. He created cheap game kits and sold them to charitable organizations, who sent them to Union soldiers in the field. For bored, terrified men waiting for the next battle, Bradley's games were a lifeline. Milton Bradley went on to build an empire. His company didn't just make games, it became one of the largest producers of educational materials in America, supporting the kindergarten movement and providing art supplies, toys, and books to schools. Bradley himself lived until 1911. His company survived the Depression, 2 world wars, and eventually merged with Hasbro in 1984. In 1960, to celebrate the company's 100th anniversary, Milton Bradley released a new version of the Game of Life, designed by inventor Reuben Klamer. But it had nothing to do with the original. Gone were the lessons about virtue and vice. Now the goal was simple: make as much money as possible. Get a job, buy a house, have kids, collect paychecks, retire to millionaire acres. The message had flipped entirely. What began as a Victorian sermon about righteousness became a celebration of the suburban American dream. From morality to money, from souls to salaries. Clue, or Cluedo, was born in the dark, literally. Before World War II, Anthony Pratt was living a charmed life. He was a gifted pianist who performed on ocean liners and an English country estate, the kind of grand manor homes where the wealthy gathered for weekend parties. At these estates, after the music ended, the guests would play a game. It was called Murder, a parlor game where guests would creep through darkened corridors pretending to stalk and kill each other. The victim would shriek and fall dramatically to the floor. Pratt later recalled, "Between the wars, all the bright young things would congregate in each other's homes for parties at weekends. We'd play this stupid game called Murder. It was great fun. Then came the war. And as Pratt put it, it all went poof. Overnight, all the fun ended." By 1943, Pratt was back in Birmingham working in a munitions factory. At night, when the air raid sirens wailed, he and his wife Elva were forced to stay indoors, trapped in blackout conditions, unable to leave, unable to see friends. Birmingham was the 3rd most bombed city in England. The threat was constant. To fight the boredom, and perhaps to escape the fear, Anthony and Elva began designing a board game in their kitchen. They recreated those lavish murder mystery parties in miniature, a Victorian mansion with 9 rooms, 10 suspects, 9 weapons. The original patent, filed in December 1944, was darker than you remember. The weapons included a bomb, a syringe, and poison. The characters had names like Dr. Black, Mr. Brown, Mr. Gold, and Miss Gray. There was even a Reverend Green, who lost his title when the game came to America. Elva designed the board, Anthony designed the mechanics. Together they called it Murder. After the war ended, Pratt sold the game to a British manufacturer called Waddington's. They renamed it Cluedo, a combination of clue and ludo, the Latin word for I play. But due to post-war material shortages, the game didn't go into production until 1949. That same year, Parker Brothers released it in America as Clue. It became a phenomenon. Millions of copies sold. It spawned a film, musicals, TV shows, countless editions. But here's where the story turns tragic. In 1953, just 4 years after Cluedo launched, Waddington's told Pratt that the game wasn't selling well, especially in America. They offered him £5,000 and about $14,000 at the time for the foreign rights. With a newborn daughter and bills to pay, Pratt accepted. What he didn't know was that they were lying. Clue was about to explode in popularity in the United States. Parker Brothers would make millions. Waddington's would make millions. And Anthony Pratt would get nothing. The money from the sale allowed him to stop working briefly, to return to his first love, music. But eventually, the money ran out. He returned to work as a solicitor's clerk. Then he and Elva bought a small sweets and tobacco shop. Later, they let holiday flats in Bournemouth. They lived modestly. In 1996, Waddington's executives decided to celebrate the 150 millionth sale of Cluedo by tracking down its creator. They launched a publicity campaign, Wanted, for murder, most enjoyable. They set up a hotline for tips. They searched everywhere. And then an undertaker called in. Anthony Pratt had died 2 years earlier, in 1994, at the age of 90, peacefully in a nursing home, nearly penniless. A game born in darkness during the terror of war became one of the most beloved games of all time. But the man who created it in his kitchen, to escape the bombs and the blackouts, never saw the fortune it created. Risk, the game of global conquest. Few games capture ambition or arrogance quite like it. It was created in 1957 by Albert Lamouris, a French filmmaker best known for his Academy Award-winning short film, The Red Balloon, a 34-minute masterpiece about a sentient balloon that follows a boy through Paris. But Lamouris had another vision. The world was still reeling from World War II. Europe was divided. The Cold War had begun. Nations were scrambling to rebuild and to secure their influence over whatever was left. Lamouris called his game La Conquête du Monde, the conquest of the world. The rules were simple: control armies, invade territories, roll dice to determine victory. The goal: dominate the entire planet. He sold the game to Miro, a French publisher who refined the rules. Then in 1959, Parker Brothers bought the rights and brought it to America, and they renamed it Risk. Risk was the first mass-market strategy game that allowed more than 2 players. It combined luck and strategy. It let you form alliances and then betray them. It let you conquer the world from your living room. But beneath the fun of rolling dice and moving armies lies an uncomfortable truth. Risk is a game built on the logic of empire, the same logic that drove European powers to carve up Africa, that justified manifest destiny, that turned the globe into a chessboard for superpowers. It's a sanitized version of conquest, stripped of blood, of consequences, of suffering. You don't see the civilians displaced. You don't hear the screams. You just roll the dice and take another territory. Albert Lamouris, ironically, died young, at age 47 in 1970, in a helicopter crash while filming in Iran. But his game lives on. A reminder that even in play, we can't escape the ghosts of history. If there's one game that feels like pure innocence, it's Candyland. Bright colors, sweet characters, no reading, no strategy, just fun. But its origins are heartbreakingly different. In the 1940s and 1950s, America was gripped by terror. Not from war, not from economic collapse, but from a disease that struck without warning and targeted children. Poliomyelitis. Polio. It attacked the nerve cells in the spinal cord, causing sudden paralysis in the legs, arms, or lungs. Some children recovered, some did not. Some spent the rest of their lives in leg braces or wheelchairs. The worst cases required an iron lung, a massive metal tube that breathed for them. Parents lived in constant fear. Public pools were closed, playgrounds shut down. Children were kept indoors away from crowds because no one understood how the virus spread. There was no prevention, no cure, no vaccine. Hospitals and sanitariums across the country were filled with children, isolated from their families for weeks, sometimes months, bored, scared, lonely. In 1948, in a San Diego hospital, a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Abbott was recovering from polio. She was 36 years old, one of the few adults in a ward full of children. She saw them suffer. She designed a game so simple that even a 3-year-old could play. No reading required, no math, no complex strategy, just colors and candy. The game was a journey through a fantastical world: the molasses swamp, the peppermint stick forest, the gumdrop mountains, the ice cream sea. And in the original version, one of the children pictured at the start of the game was wearing a leg brace. For children confined to hospital beds, unable to walk, unable to play outside, Candyland offered something precious: the fantasy of movement. You could travel, you could explore, you could race toward a destination, home sweet home, even if your body couldn't. The game was so popular among the children in Abbott's ward that she pitched it to Milton Bradley. They published it in 1949, and it became their best-selling game almost overnight. The timing was perfect. Post-war America, the baby boom, a thriving economy, families with young children and money to spend. And during polio outbreaks, when children couldn't go to pools or parks, Candyland could be played alone, indoors, safely. In 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk developed the first successful polio vaccine. By the 1960s, polio cases in the US had dropped by 90%. Today, it's nearly eradicated worldwide. As for Eleanor Abbott, she never promoted the connection between Candyland and polio. Milton Bradley never advertised it. She lived quietly in San Diego with her sister until her death in 1988, largely unknown. Legend says she donated all her royalties from Candyland to charities for children in need. Today, 94% of mothers recognize Candyland. More than 60% of families with a 5-year-old child own it. About 1 million copies are sold every year. A game born in a hospital ward, designed to give paralyzed children the gift of imaginary movement, became one of the most beloved children's games of all time. Then there's Operation, a game about precision and punishment for mistakes. In 1962, John Spinello was a college student at the University of Illinois, studying industrial design. For a class project, he designed a game. The idea came to him as a child, when he stuck a safety pin into an electrical outlet and got shocked. His game worked the same way: a metal probe, a buzzer, and a board with holes. Touch the edges and you complete a circuit. The buzzer sounds. He called it Death Valley. A family friend worked for Marvin Glass Associates, a legendary Chicago toy design firm responsible for Lightbreed, Mousetrap, and Simon. The friend set up a meeting. Spinello brought his prototype. Marvin Glass tested it. The moment he accidentally triggered the loud buzzer, Glass knew this was a hit. Glass made Spinello an offer, $500 for the design, and the promise of a job when he graduated. Spinello, young, eager, and trusting, signed away all rights. Glass sold the game to Milton Bradley, who redesigned it into Operation, complete with a cartoon patient named Cavity Sam, plastic body parts with punny names, and tweezers instead of a probe. The game launched in 1965. It became a massive success. Over the next 50 years, Operation sold millions of copies. It spawned countless editions: Spider-Man, Shrek, The Simpsons. It became a cultural icon. Estimates suggest it generated at least $40 million in sales. As for John Spinello, the job Marvin Glass promised him never materialized. He went on to run a warehouse and shipping business, which hit hard times during the 2008 recession. In 2014, at age 77, Spinello needed $25,000 in oral surgery. He didn't have insurance to cover it. The inventor of Operation, they couldn't afford an operation. He and his wife declared bankruptcy. When his friends, toy designers Tim Walsh and Peggy Brown, learned of his situation, they launched a crowdfunding campaign. The story went viral. Good Morning America, NBC Nightly News, Jimmy Kimmel Live. People donated more than $32,000. Doctors wrote to say that operation inspired them to become surgeons. One doctor at Johns Hopkins even invented a medical device that works exactly like the game. A buzzer that alerts surgeons when they are getting too close to delicate nerves during surgery. It's been used in nearly 1 million real operations. Hasbro, who now owns the rights to Operation, stepped in as well. They purchased Spinello's original Death Valley prototype to help pay for his medical costs. For the record, Spinello says he's not bitter. "I prefer not to dwell on that aspect," he told reporters, and focus more on the joy that the game has brought to so many over the years. But the irony is impossible to ignore. The man who made a game about operations couldn't afford one himself. Even Scrabble, the ultimate word game, was born from desperation. Alfred Mosher Butts was an unemployed architect in Poughkeepsie, New York, laid off during the Great Depression. With nothing but time on his hands, he analyzed the front page of the New York Times, counting the frequency of each letter in the English language. He spent years developing a game he called Lexico, then Criss-Crosswords, combining anagrams with a crossword-style board. Every major game manufacturer rejected it. For 15 years. Finally, in 1948, a man named James Brunot bought the rights, simplified the rules, renamed it Scrabble, and began making sets by hand in his garage. Sales were slow until 1952, when the president of Macy's played it on vacation, fell in love with it, and ordered it for his store. The game exploded. Butts finally received royalties, modest ones, but enough to live comfortably. He never became rich, but unlike so many other inventors, he at least received credit for his creation. Trivial Pursuit was invented in 1979 by two Canadian journalists, Chris Haney and Scott Abbott, who were frustrated that pieces were missing from their Scrabble set. Over beers, they decided to create their own game. They spent the next 2 years writing 6,000 questions, mortgaging their homes to fund production. The game launched in 1982 and bombed. Then in 1984, it suddenly took off. 20 million copies sold in 1 year. It became the biggest game phenomenon since Monopoly. But success brought problems. Over 30 lawsuits were filed against the creators, from people claiming they'd stolen questions, plagiarized trivia books, or copied ideas from earlier games. The most famous case came from Fred L. Worth, author of The Trivia Encyclopedia. He claimed Trivial Pursuit had copied hundreds of his questions, and he could prove it. He deliberately planted a false answer in his book as a trap. The question was about the character name in a film, and Worth had intentionally gotten it wrong. That exact wrong answer appeared in Trivial Pursuit, but the judge ruled against him. Facts cannot be copyrighted, even if you compile them. Even if you get them wrong. Worth spent years researching and compiling trivia. He proved the theft, and the court said it didn't matter. It's a legal technicality that sounds reasonable on paper, but in practice, it meant someone could photocopy thousands of hours of your work, make hundreds of millions of dollars, and face zero consequences. The law protected the people who took and punished the person who created. Haney and Abbott kept their fortune. Worth got nothing, not even an apology. And then there's Dungeons & Dragons, the game that didn't just have a dark history. It was accused of causing one. In the early 1980s, a moral panic swept America. Parents, religious groups, and media outlets claimed that D&D was teaching children witchcraft, summoning demons, and driving teenagers to suicide. It started with the tragic death of James Dallas Egbert III, a 16-year-old genius who disappeared from Michigan State University in 1979. A private investigator suggested, without evidence, that Egbert might be lost in the university's steam tunnels, acting out a real-life D&D game. The media ran with it. CBS aired a TV movie called Mazes and Monsters starring Tom Hanks, depicting a college student who loses his grip on reality while playing the game. 60 Minutes did multiple segments questioning whether D&D was dangerous. Schools banned it. Churches held book burnings. But study after study found no connection between role-playing games and violence or suicide. Egbert, it turned out, had struggled with depression and family pressure. D&D had nothing to do with his disappearance. He died by suicide a year later. Gary Gygax spent years defending his creation, watching his game, built on imagination and storytelling, turned into a scapegoat for parents' fears. Today, D&D is more popular than ever. Celebrities play it on live streams. Therapists use it for social skills training. It's celebrated as a creative, collaborative art form. But for over a decade, its creators were accused of corrupting an entire generation. Every game tells two stories. The one on the box, bright, cheerful, simple. And the one beneath it, the real story of who made it, why they made it, and what happened to them after. These games became part of our lives because they touched something true. The fear of losing everything, Monopoly, the hope of living a good life, the game of life, the thrill of solving a mystery, Clue, the fantasy of adventure, Risk, the joy of simple movement, Candyland, the precision required to heal, Operation. But behind every dice roll, every card drawn, every spinner spun, are the invisible hands of people who gave us these worlds. Some were rewarded, most were not. So the next time you sit down to play, take a moment. Look at the box. Read the name of the inventor if it's there. And remember, someone, somewhere dreamed this into existence. And their story, the real story, is always more interesting than the game.